the IEEE Annals of the History of Computing have, in the last 2 years, have had a number of articles by people involved in the electronic publishing industry that we shouldn't forget. That includes people involved in some of the early typesetting devices that were optical and digital, people involved in font design, people involved in the PostScript industry. Chuck Geschke, who we lost just a couple of months ago, was one of the authors. There's another journal that a few months ago, managed to put together an almost complete bibliography called Learned Publishing. And they've managed to get most of the issues online. There are a small number of omissions, but that's also worth looking at. And finally, I observed that IEEE is indeed a large publisher. They handle and produce proceedings of thousands of conferences a year in engineering and science. And 3 or 4 years ago, they introduced a free journal called the IEEE Open Journal. And I thought, well, maybe I should look at this and consider it for inclusion in the TUG archives. But when I looked into it, I found that last year there were 250,000 pages in that journal. It's just mind-boggling how much is being published. And so I can't keep up with it. It's just beyond my abilities. But certainly the fact that these are all being done electronically now means we will have them preserved. I mean, a big problem with older print journals, of course, is that they were printed on paper that deteriorated over time, and often with hand-cut fonts that sometimes weren't all that great. And so the quality is bad, and it makes it really hard to do optical character recognition to recover a journal from 1750 into a digital form that you could manage to read today.
Awesome.
Well, I've been highly entertained listening to the two of you. I can recall how in the early days of the use of tech, there was a printer at Stanford in the department where Donald Knuth worked, where all of the tech output went. And it was a Xerox printer. And it was this Xerox printer that had been retrofit with some sort of laser device that painted the image onto the semiconductor drum, which back in those days was not a semiconductor plastic belt, but an actual metal semiconductor. I've forgotten the particular chemical element involved, but it was something like selenium. And that's how we used to get our output from tech. But it was kind of ironic because then there was this seminal involvement between Xerox PARC and Apple that ultimately led to that very significant Apple laser writer, which is the one that I bought. Because back in those days, you could actually, a mere mortal could own a computer that would typeset with tech. It was a Mac Plus, and output to an Apple laser writer. So this was a marvelous time. And the entire field of xerography changed, so that ultimately that Xerox printer became something of a dinosaur, but technology moved very quickly.
in a meeting in London. Back to Stanford with the Xerox printing device, there was another one we mustn't forget, and that was the AutoLogic Apps 5. I think it was Dave Fuchs who told me that one day a truck pulled up to the loading dock of the Department of Computer Science and deposited this rather large machine and left. And they had to figure out what to do with this. There was limited documentation. And of course, things like font encodings were highly proprietary. So Stanford had the job of figuring out how to use this thing. Ken Thompson at Bell Labs was facing a similar thing with another phototypesetter, the CAT typesetter. And he has an interesting technical report on how they spent a summer reverse engineering the fonts on that device so they could add new things and use it. Chuck Bigelow also has written both in Tugboat and in Learned Publishing and elsewhere papers on the history of fonts and copyrights of fonts and so on that are worth digging into before one sets down to write a more detailed history of this field. I mean, there's been a lot of things happening, and the big problem Knuth faced when he developed TeX was that it became very quickly clear that he couldn't develop TeX in isolation. He had to have a font design system because the fonts that were available from the commercial typesetters lacked the character glyphs that one needed in mathematics. And one needed to be able to design new ones because mathematicians are always inventing new funny looking squiggles that they want to see in their papers. So Metafont came into being about the same time as TeX and was done much the same way. And it's really quite astonishing that when you do line counts on the Pascal source code, they're both about 20,000 lines. It's remarkable that these things that have really nothing to do with one another came out to be roughly the same size program. And that's a good number to remember because it's about the amount a good programmer can keep in his or her head and to have an overview of a program. One software reaches into the hundreds of thousands and millions of lines of code. There's no single person who knows what's going on. And it becomes a lot harder to control. And software, unfortunately, often in large systems grows like topsy and becomes unmanageable. So it's certainly been a fun history. Fonts, of course, have been an issue for TeX because at many sites, a lot of people sort of assumed that the only fonts that could be used with TeX were those that came with it, namely Computer Modern. And that led to the production of large numbers of technical reports and books all done with the same font families when in reality, one would have liked to have used more. And so one of the great contributions of XeTeX and LuaTeX and PDFTeX is that they've made a much larger repertoire of fonts available for people to use. And I think that's really a good thing. I encourage our students doing theses and dissertations, please go explore the font repertoire, find something different, make your thesis different from everyone else's. I mean, you have to follow certain formatting guidelines, but at least it shouldn't be the same set of boring fonts that you've seen far too often in reports.